April 10th, 1941. Tobruk, Libya. 0430 hours. The desert was still dark when the sound arrived. Not engines, not artillery. A rising mechanical scream that cut through the night air and pressed into the chest. German Stuka dive bombers broke through the clouds and tipped forward, sirens howling as they plunged toward the ground. Seconds later, the earth erupted. 500-pound bombs struck the perimeter in rapid sequence. Sand, stone, and concrete were thrown into the air. The shock waves rolled through the trenches, snapping communication lines and collapsing dugouts. The smell of cordite mixed with dust so thick it coated teeth and eyes. Men pressed themselves flat against trench walls as the ground shook beneath them. This was not a warning raid. This was the opening move. Along the outer defences of Tobruk, Australian soldiers waited for daylight, knowing what it would bring. They had spent the night repairing wire, reinforcing Italian concrete bunkers, checking weapons by touch. Now, as the bombing lifted, the desert began to glow grey. At one forward position, a young lieutenant from Sydney's western suburbs raised his head above a sandbag parapet. Through drifting smoke and early morning haze, he saw movement on the horizon. At first, it looked like shadows. Then the shapes became clear. A line of German panzers rolled forward out of the desert, spread wide, gun barrels levelled toward the city. Behind them came trucks, infantry, and more armour, an organised advance, deliberate and confident. The lieutenant lowered his head slowly. Behind him stood 14,000 Australian soldiers. Farmers from Victoria, shearers from Queensland, dock workers, clerks, mechanics. Men who had enlisted together in 1939, believing the war would be short. Men who had crossed half the world and now found themselves in shallow trenches carved into rock and sand. They were all that stood between the Afrika Korps and the North African coast. The radio crackled in the command post. All positions, hold your ground. There will be no retreat. There were no speeches, no cheering, just a quiet acknowledgement that this was the line and this was where it would be held. What unfolded at Tobruk was not meant to happen. Until this moment, the German war machine had advanced without pause. Poland collapsed in weeks. France in days. Everywhere the Wehrmacht struck, defenders either broke or withdrew. Speed, armour, and air power had made resistance seem temporary at best. But Tobruk was different. This was the first time Hitler's forces were not chasing a retreating enemy, but confronting one ordered to stay. Not delay, not withdraw. Hold. For the next 242 days, this isolated port would test a simple question that had not yet been answered in the war. Could German momentum be stopped by defiance alone? As the panzers advanced and artillery crews took aim, the answer was still unknown. The sound of tank treads grew louder. The siege of Tobruk had begun. April 1941. Across Europe, the war appeared decided. Adolf Hitler controlled the continent from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. France had fallen the previous summer. The Low Countries were occupied. Britain stood alone, battered by months of bombing. Its army recently evacuated from Dunkirk with most of its heavy equipment left behind. In North Africa, the situation had deteriorated just as rapidly. Only weeks earlier, British forces had enjoyed a brief success during Operation Compass, shattering the Italian 10th Army and advancing hundreds of miles across Libya. That momentum collapsed almost overnight with the arrival of Erwin Rommel. Rommel landed in Tripoli in February 1941 with limited forces and explicit orders to stabilize the front. Instead, he immediately went on the offensive. Using speed, deception, and aggressive maneuver, he reversed the entire campaign in less than 2 weeks. British units fell back in confusion. Equipment was abandoned. Command structures broke down. By early April, Rommel had driven the British nearly 500 miles east, pushing them back toward Egypt. Only one Allied stronghold remained behind his advancing forces: Tobruk. Tobruk was not valuable because of its size. It mattered because of its harbour. It was the only deep-water port between Tripoli, 900 miles to the west, and Alexandria, 500 miles to the east. Without Tobruk, Rommel's supply lines stretched across open desert, vulnerable and slow. With Tobruk in enemy hands, every ton of fuel, ammunition and food had to be hauled by truck across impossible distances. Strategically, Tobruk controlled the coastal road, the single reliable artery for mechanized warfare in North Africa. Whoever held it dictated movement along the entire front. For Germany, Tobruk was the key to Egypt. If Rommel captured it, he could push on to the Nile Delta, threaten the Suez Canal, and sever Britain's main imperial lifeline. Supplies from India, Australia, and the Far East would be forced around the Cape of Good Hope. The British position in the Middle East would become untenable. The stakes extended far beyond the desert. At the same time, Hitler was preparing for Operation Barbarossa. North Africa was a secondary theatre, but only if it remained quiet. A prolonged struggle there meant aircraft, fuel, and experienced units diverted from the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. For Britain, the calculation was stark. If Tobruk fell, Egypt was exposed. If Egypt fell, the Middle East followed. Oil fields in Iraq and Persia became vulnerable. The war effort itself was threatened. The forces facing each other reflected this imbalance. Inside Tobruk were roughly 14,000 Australians of the 9th Division, reinforced by British artillery units and Indian infantry, about 22,000 men in total. They were under-equipped, short of transport, and completely cut off by land. Outside the perimeter stood Rommel's Afrika Korps, 2 armoured divisions, experienced and confident, over 100 tanks, mobile 88mm guns capable of destroying any Allied armour at long range, complete air superiority with the Luftwaffe free to strike the port daily. From London, Winston Churchill sent a direct message. Tobruk must be held. There is to be no surrender and no retreat. If Tobruk held, Rommel would be forced to besiege it, pinning his forces in place, stretching his supply lines, and bleeding time he could not afford. If it fell, there would be nothing left to stop him. This was no longer a local fight. It was a hinge on which the entire North African war turned. The men defending Tobruk were not professional soldiers in the European sense. The core of the garrison was the 9th Australian Division, a formation raised largely from civilians who had volunteered in 1939. Many had joined in groups, workmates, football teammates, brothers and cousins, convinced the war would be finished before they ever saw combat. Most were in their early 20s. Few had travelled beyond their home states. Many had never left Australia before boarding troop ships in Sydney or Melbourne. Now they stood on the edge of the Libyan desert, defending an unfamiliar city with unfamiliar weapons against an enemy whose reputation loomed large. They were commanded by a man who understood exactly what they faced. Leslie Morshead was 52 years old. He had fought at Gallipoli and on the Western Front in the First World War. In civilian life, he had been a school teacher. Among his men, he carried the nickname Ming the Merciless, not for cruelty, but for discipline. He demanded preparation, clarity, and obedience. Sloppiness, he believed, killed soldiers. Morshead rejected the idea that a siege meant passive defence. He made his position clear from the outset. "There'll be no Dunkirk here," he told his officers. "If we go out, we'll fight our way out." His strategy rested on one principle. Morale would not survive if the men simply waited to be attacked. The defenders would raid, patrol, and counterattack. They would make the besiegers pay for every yard. Among the ranks were men like Private Jim Gordon of the 213th Battalion, a sheep shearer from rural Queensland. He had enlisted with 7 friends from his town. 6 were with him inside Tobruk. 1 had already been killed earlier in the campaign. Gordon had no illusions about glory. His letters home spoke only of dust, flies, and fatigue. There was Lieutenant Austin Tich McKell, an artillery officer from Melbourne. Before the war, he had worked as a bank clerk. He had a talent for mathematics, now applied to calculating firing tables for 25-pounder guns under pressure. His work would decide whether advancing armour lived or burned. And there was Corporal John Hurst Edmondson of the 217th Battalion. Quiet, methodical, respected by his section. Within weeks, he would lead a bayonet charge against a German machine gun position, holding it long enough for his platoon to counterattack. He would not survive the night. These men were not considered elite. British commandos were elsewhere. So were the armoured formations. What the Australians possessed instead was a shared attitude shaped by distance, isolation, and experience. They distrusted inflated reputations. They relied on each other. They met danger with blunt humour. When Axis radio broadcasts mocked them as rats caught in a trap, the insult failed to land. The name stuck, but not as intended. Within days, the defenders were calling themselves the Rats of Tobruk. Some even painted rats on signs and vehicles. What was meant as humiliation became identity. Their physical situation offered little comfort. The defences around Tobruk were inherited from the Italians. A 30-mile perimeter of concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and wire. Much of it was damaged. Some positions were unfinished. Gaps existed everywhere. Artillery was limited. Ammunition was rationed. There was no air cover. All supplies came by sea, at night, under constant threat of air attack. On April 10th, as German armour gathered beyond the wire, the defenders understood what was being asked of them. They were not expected to break out. They were not expected to win a campaign. They were expected to hold. And for the first time in the war, ordinary soldiers would test whether resolve alone could stop momentum. From the first days of the siege, the mathematics of Tobruk worked against its defenders. The perimeter stretched nearly 30 miles. Concrete strongpoints and shallow trenches followed the contours of rocky desert, rising and falling across ridges and wadis. Inside that line were roughly 22,000 men, including artillery crews, engineers, medics, and support troops. Spread evenly, it amounted to fewer than 700 defenders per mile. German doctrine held that a position so thin should collapse within 48 hours. Rommel wasted no time testing that assumption. Between April 10th and April 14th, probing attacks struck multiple sectors each day. Small armoured thrusts advanced under artillery cover, searching for weak points. Infantry followed close behind, prepared to exploit any breach. Each attack forced the defenders to react instantly. There were no second lines to fall back on. If the perimeter cracked in one place, the entire defence would unravel. The imbalance in equipment was stark. The Australians relied on rifles, Bren guns, light mortars, and a limited number of field artillery pieces, many already worn from earlier fighting. Their anti-tank guns were few and outdated. Ammunition was carefully counted and rationed. Outside the wire, Rommel commanded more than 100 tanks, supported by mobile 88mm guns that could destroy Allied armour or bunkers at long range. Above them, the Luftwaffe controlled the sky. Stuka dive bombers struck the port and perimeter daily, sometimes 3 times a day, with no meaningful opposition. Tobruk itself was a trap. Surrounded on 3 sides by open desert, the garrison had nowhere to retreat. To the east, the nearest British forces were more than 80 miles away, disorganised and too weak to break through, even if they attempted it. By land, Tobruk was isolated. By sea, survival depended on chance. Every supply ship had to run a narrow gauntlet, enemy aircraft by day, submarines and torpedo boats by night. Some never arrived. Others were hit unloading at the docks. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies all arrived late, damaged, or in reduced quantities. Water quickly became critical. The town's desalination plant had been damaged earlier in the campaign. Rations dropped to half a gallon per man per day. That allowance covered drinking, cooking, and washing wounds in desert heat that climbed above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men learned to shave dry, wash with sand, and swallow thirst. Over all of it loomed Rommel's reputation. He was already known as the Desert Fox, a commander who led from the front, moved faster than his enemies could react, and exploited hesitation without mercy. His advance across Libya had seemed effortless. Intelligence reports circulated that he expected Tobruk to fall within 3 days. Axis propaganda reinforced the pressure. Radio broadcasts mocked the defenders nightly, predicting surrender and promising safe treatment if they gave up now. The message was clear. Resistance was pointless. The comparison was unavoidable. Only months earlier, Italian forces had abandoned Tobruk with minimal resistance, surrendering tens of thousands of men in a single day. The Australians now occupied many of the same positions, with fewer troops and a far stronger enemy closing in. Everything about the situation suggested inevitability. No reinforcements were coming. No air cover would appear. Ammunition would only decrease. Disease would spread. Heat and exhaustion would grind the garrison down. Time favoured the besieger. The Germans needed to succeed once. The defenders had to succeed every time. And if they failed, Tobruk would fall, not with a single dramatic collapse, but with a quiet breach that would change the course of the war. The first week decided whether Tobruk would live or die. Rommel struck almost immediately. He believed speed would break the defence before it could harden, just as it had everywhere else. Between April 10th and April 16th, attacks came daily, sometimes several in the same sector, sometimes spread along the perimeter to force confusion. April 11th, Good Friday, became the first real test. Just after dawn, Stuka dive bombers appeared over the southwestern perimeter near Post R6. Their sirens screamed as they plunged, bombs walking across the ground in tight patterns. Trenches collapsed. Wire was torn apart. Dust reduced visibility to meters. At 06:45 hours, German armor advanced. Observers counted 38 tanks moving in formation, infantry riding on their hulls. The approach was confident, methodical. It was how German attacks were supposed to look. The defenders waited. Major General Morshead's instructions were precise. Anti-tank guns were not to fire at long range. Every round mattered. The gunners held their fire until the tanks crossed a pre-measured line. At 400 yards, the order was given. Every gun opened at once. 2 panzers burst into flames immediately. A third slewed sideways, tracks blown apart. The rest hesitated, unsure whether they had driven into a minefield or a trap. In that pause, Australian infantry surged forward from concealed positions, firing Bren guns into vision slits and throwing grenades at exposed crews. By 07:30 hours, the attack stalled. Rommel ordered a withdrawal. 5 tanks were lost. Australian casualties numbered fewer than 20. The lesson was immediate and dangerous. The Afrika Korps could be hurt. 2 days later, Rommel committed more force. On April 13th and 14th, he launched coordinated assaults against multiple points along the perimeter. The aim was simple: stretch the defence until it snapped. Near Hill, 209, German infantry and armour punched through, penetrating nearly 2 miles inside the line. For 6 hours, Tobruk stood on the edge. Morshead committed his only reserve. 2 infantry companies held back for this moment alone. The order was blunt: retake the ground at any cost. What followed was not manoeuvre warfare. It was close, brutal fighting in trenches and around shattered bunkers. Bayonets were fixed, grenades were thrown by hand. At one position, Corporal John Edmondson charged a machine gun post alone, killing the crew before being mortally wounded. His action bought the time needed for the line to be restored. By midnight on April 14th, the Germans were forced back out. 17 tanks had been destroyed. Rommel's expectation of a quick victory was gone. What replaced it was pressure. From mid-April into May, the siege settled into a grinding rhythm. Artillery fire became constant. Stuka attacks arrived daily at nearly the same hour, a routine the defenders called the Daily Hate. Nights brought probing attacks, flares, and sudden firefights in the dark. Supply became the central struggle. Royal Navy destroyers began what sailors called the Tobruk ferry service, high-speed runs from Alexandria under cover of darkness. They had 4 hours to unload before dawn. Many were damaged, some were sunk. Food was cut to 1 meal a day. Bully beef and hard biscuits became standard. Cigarettes turned into currency. Mooreshead refused to allow passivity. Australian patrols crossed their own wire at night, crawling into no man's land to ambush German positions. On May 3rd, a raiding party struck far behind the lines, destroying a supply dump and capturing documents that revealed how thin Rommel's logistics had become. The psychological balance shifted. By late April, Rommel understood Tobruk would not fall quickly. Intercepts revealed that British command intended to hold it indefinitely. The siege that was meant to secure his rear had become a drain on his strength. By May, Tobruk was no longer about collapse. It was about endurance, and neither side was yet willing to concede it. By mid-June 1941, the siege had settled into a deadlock that neither side could afford. For the defenders, endurance was becoming as dangerous as battle. Casualties mounted steadily. Disease spread through the trenches. Ammunition stocks thinned. Men had been under bombardment for more than 2 months with no clear end in sight. For Rommel, Tobruk had become a strategic burden. As long as the port remained in Allied hands, he could not safely advance into Egypt. Supplies had to be diverted to contain the garrison. Time, his greatest weapon, was slipping away. In London, Churchill demanded action. The result was Operation Battle Axe. On June 15, 1941, British forces in Egypt launched a major offensive aimed at breaking through German lines and relieving Tobruk. 25,000 troops and nearly 200 tanks advanced west toward the frontier. Inside Tobruk, the garrison was ordered to prepare for a breakout. When the relief force arrived, the defenders would attack from within, trapping Rommel between 2 fronts. Before dawn, the distant sound of artillery carried faintly across the desert. Inside Tobruk, hope returned cautiously. Men checked weapons. Officers reviewed plans. For the first time since April, there was a sense that the siege might end not with evacuation or surrender, but with attack. It lasted less than a day. Rommel reacted instantly. He allowed the British armour to advance, then struck with concealed 88mm guns. At ranges far beyond what British tanks could answer, the guns opened fire. One after another, armoured vehicles burned in the open desert. By evening on June 15th, the offensive had stalled. Nearly 50 British tanks lay destroyed. Communications were confused. Units became separated. Momentum vanished. Inside Tobruk, the defenders listened to the distant explosions and understood what silence meant. The next day brought the most dangerous decision of the siege. Orders arrived from Cairo instructing the garrison to prepare to sortie in support of the failing attack. A breakout against prepared German positions would be costly, but obedience was expected. Mooreshead gathered his senior officers. The risks were clear. If the relief force had already withdrawn, an attack from Tobruk could end in disaster. Throughout June 16th, conflicting reports arrived by radio. Some suggested renewed fighting. Others hinted at retreat. No one had certainty. That night, Australian units moved into assault positions. Ammunition was issued. Bayonets were fixed. Artillery crews prepared to fire until their guns were exhausted. Many men wrote letters home. Chaplains moved quietly through the trenches. Shortly after midnight, a coded signal arrived. It took 20 minutes to decrypt. Operation Battle Axe had been cancelled. The relief force was withdrawing. Tobruk was to continue holding. At 0:25 hours on June 17th, the order to attack was rescinded. Units stood down. Men returned silently to their defensive positions. The reaction was complex. Relief mixed with bitterness. Dark humour surfaced. But beneath it was a harder understanding. They were alone again. Operation Battle Axe had failed completely. British forces withdrew, having lost more than 90 tanks and nearly 1,000 casualties. Rommel had won another defensive victory. For Tobruk, the meaning was unmistakable. There would be no quick relief. The siege was no longer temporary. It was indefinite. From that night onward, the defenders stopped counting days toward rescue and began counting only the days they survived. The struggle had passed its point of decision and entered its most dangerous phase. The outcome would now be decided not by plans or offensives, but by who broke first. In November 1941, the balance finally shifted. On November 18th, the British Eighth Army launched Operation Crusader. This time, the scale was different. More than 100,000 troops advanced across the desert with over 700 tanks. The lessons of earlier failures had been absorbed. Command was clearer, coordination was tighter, and time was no longer on Rommel's side. Inside Tobruk, the garrison prepared once more for a breakout. For months, they had listened to distant fighting fade away. Now the sound grew closer each day. On November 21st, New Zealand forces broke through German positions east of the fortress. 5 days later, on November 26th, British armour entered Tobruk. The siege was over. 242 days had passed. There were no celebrations. Men stood in their trenches, too thin, too tired to cheer. Some cried quietly, others simply watched, unable to process that it had ended. The cost had been severe. The 9th Australian Division suffered more than 800 killed, over 2,000 wounded, and nearly 1,000 captured or missing. British and other Commonwealth units added another 1,200 casualties. Nearly 1 in 5 defenders became a casualty during the siege. Beyond the numbers lay the damage that records could not capture. Most men had endured chronic dysentery. Desert sores refused to heal. Jaundice and heat exhaustion were common. Medical reports described what was later called siege neurosis, men shaking uncontrollably under shell fire, unable to sleep, permanently altered. Some never recovered. Private Jim Gordon survived and returned to Australia in 1942. He rarely spoke of Tobruk again. Lieutenant Austin McKell was wounded in October and evacuated by destroyer. He would fight again in Italy. Corporal John Edmondson did not live to see the siege lifted. His Victoria Cross was awarded posthumously, the first Australian VC of the war. Rommel recorded his assessment privately. "The defence of Tobruk," he wrote, "was one of the finest feats of arms in this war." Strategically, the consequences were decisive. Holding Tobruk delayed Rommel for 8 critical months. That delay forced Germany to divert resources at the very moment Hitler launched the invasion of the Soviet Union. It bought Britain time to rebuild its army in Egypt and prepare for victory at El Alamein. The myth of German invincibility was broken, not by retreat, but by refusal. In June 1942, Rommel would finally capture Tobruk in a single day. But by then, the moment had passed. The Australians were gone. The war had turned. In Australia, the defenders returned home as the Japanese threat emerged in the Pacific. Their welcome was subdued, but their name endured. The Rats of Tobruk entered the national memory as a mark of stubborn courage. The siege proved something simple and enduring. That ordinary men, well led and unwilling to yield, could stop an enemy who expected them to break. For 242 days, they held. And that was enough.